Chapter 22. Today we're going to be talking about postmodern design. Chapter 22, postmodern design. So we're moving out of the real international typographic style and into an era around the 1970s. So by the 1970s, a lot of people kind of believed that the modern era was drawing to a close. In all fashions, within art, within literature, design, politics. That idea of modernism, of trying to be new and modern, was going away, and we were entering into something new. So the climate started to shift in the mid-1970s. There was a awareness of the aesthetic that was being used in modernism that people started to realize was no longer relevant to what was happening in a kind of post-industrial revolution society. There were certain things like trying to create beauty out of the machine. That was a new and interesting topic in the 1920s, 30s, even up to the 40s and 50s. But by the 70s, it was something that was commonplace. It wasn't an interesting topic anymore. And so designers started to realize that design needed to be completely overhauled. And with that overhaul, a lot of people within the design community started to embrace the term postmodernism to express that kind of climate of change. Postmodernism, all that means is after modernism. So that we're moving after modernism. So specifically, postmodernism has this definition. It is designated to a work of architects and designers who are breaking the international typographic style that was so prevalent and so used since the Bauhaus. So since the Bauhaus came on the style, everything started to be simplified, started to be clean, a lot of sans serif type. And this was really the time that the postmodernists started to work against that. And like we've talked so many times in this class, see the past, process through the present, create the future. That's what they were doing. They were seeing what was happening in the past with the Bauhaus, with the international typographic style. They were processing it through the present, that their lives were different than when that style started, and created a new future in postmodernism. It's really thought, especially at this time with a lot of designers, that the international typographic style had been so refined and explored and accepted that a backlash was really inevitable. There was nowhere else to really go, and so designers knew that if we keep working in this style, we're going to have to find something new eventually. Postmodern design is often focused on the subject of, is often very subjective and eccentric. What that means is it can have different meanings. It's kind of interpretive and is much more abstract than some of the styles we were looking at before. The artist in this style kind of becomes a performer for an audience to where the audience either sees the piece and responds to it or sees it and moves on. Instead of being something that the artist is merely presenting for enjoyment, it's something that is a two-way conversation in postmodernism. So let's talk about kind of the early years of postmodernism. So postmodernism really started to start in Switzerland, in that area, especially with kind of the Bauhaus happening in that area, the international typographic style coming out of the Switzerland area. Postmodernism really was the first to hit in Switzerland. The tendency toward postmodern graphic design really emerged from people that were working in the typographic, international typographic style. So what that means is people were really, really good at working in the international typographic style, but they got bored of it and decided to move on to something new. Now that something new was a movement toward neutral and objective typography. So instead of being clean and precise and clear like the international typographic style wanted, they started to skew a little bit and start to say, what could we do instead of what should we do? One of the earliest indications of this kind of postmodern movement was a print ad that was published in 1964, and that print ad is shown here. So what's influential about this print ad is look at it for a second and try to pick out what it's communicating. What are the things that it's trying to say, and why is it different? So keep in mind, at this time, we're coming out of the international typographic style. We have that jagged right edge. We have a very clear and concise way of communicating, corporate identities were being laid out on grids. Everything was similar, the same. It wanted to be clear. So they came out with this ad. And why is this so different? Take a minute, just think about it. So the answer is this ad was not clear at all. It was totally against the international typographic style while still staying familiar. It was keeping that kind of black and white theme that we've seen with the style, and it is still clean and have a lot of negative space, but what they're showing in this ad is for you to interpret, that the reader would look at this and without having to read something that clearly said, hey, we print in color, we can print outlines, we can print patterns, we can print type. They showed all these things in kind of a hodgepodge, very abstract way. This is very, very stereotypical of the postmodern look. It is meant to be seen by the viewer and then interpreted and processed by the viewer instead of kind of being spoon-fed like in the international typographic style. So the first designer that we're going to talk about in this style started working in 1966, and his name was Siegfried Odermatt. Siegfried Odermatt. He designed a trademark for the Union Safe Company. Now, the Union Safe Company, this logo that he made for them was the exact opposite of what was happening in Swiss design. It was the kind of revolt against the international typographic style. The letter forms in his logo that he created were so jammed together that it really created a form instead of being individual letters. He wanted to almost be an image. He would always, and you need to know this for your quiz, he would always sacrifice legibility for style. He didn't care if you could read it, he cared if you felt it. He wanted to see, really evoke an emotion in you. So look at this image. This is the Union Safe Company logo that he created. And think about the words that it brings to mind when you look at it. You think of strong, you think of sturdy, you think of condensed, unbreakable. When you look at this type, it really has a voice behind it. Think of if someone was saying this word union to you, what would that person look like? They'd be kind of this beefy person that's unbreakable, Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of type. And that's what Siegfried Odermatt wanted. He didn't care if you could read the word union. He wanted you to feel that Union was sturdy, that it was unbreakable, that it was a safe company that you could never, ever crack. So he continued working in this style and kind of experimenting with what he could do with type. And he eventually turned to typeface design. A lot of his typeface designs produced kind of unexpected letters that were new and abstract and became extremely popular, like this set here. Again, he was focused on not if you could read it, but if you could feel it. More about interpretive rather than literal. So moving on, the next designer we're going to talk about is Steph Geisbuehler. Steph Geisbuehler. He started working with the Geigy Pharmaceutical Company in the 1960s, mid-1960s. And his style is much like Siegfried Odermatt in that he didn't care if you could read it, he wanted it to be interesting. So he would sacrifice legibility and readability for dynamic visual organization. So he'd sacrifice readability for style. He started to work with Schermeyeff and Gasmart. We've talked about them a little bit before. They made a lot of the trademarks that are famous now. Creating identities for Time Warner, NBC, Telemundo, Union Pacific Corporation, Toledo Museum of Art, Crane & Co., and a lot of department stores. So Steph Geisbuehler really started to work kind of in the big time after he had his style. But once he started out, where he started out, like we said, he would sacrifice readability for style. So this here, the next image I'm going to show you, is a brochure cover for an event, trying to promote an event to get someone there. So, as you can see, it's almost impossible to read. You can pretty much only see Geigy, which is the pharmaceutical company he was working for, and that's about it. But it has a distinct style. So he didn't care if you could read it, he cared if it had a style to it, if it made you feel something. This makes you feel like it's swirling, like it has movement, it makes you excited, makes you interested. And that's what he wanted. Ottermatt and Geisbuehler and a lot of the others working in the 1960s didn't really rebel against the international typographic style, but really started to expand it. In the 1970s, that expansion was kind of followed by an extreme revolt. That revolt was called New Wave typography. This is an example of kind of New Wave typography, and so is this. So this is some more work by Steph Geisbuehler. And what does this make you feel? Let's talk about your feelings. Hopefully the things you're picking up for this is that it's in motion. There's action. It's making you feel anxious, like you need to go somewhere, like there's some kind of momentum happening, like it's the age of industry that you're being swept up in. So again, Steph Geisbuehler would design in that style to make you feel something. Remember, postmodernism is all about not what you see, but what you feel. It's about interacting with the piece and really making the viewer part of your composition or your design. So continuing with New Wave typography, it began as a kind of revolting movement, like we said, and revolted against modernism. It started to revolt about 40 years later, after Jansje Koltz was on the scene and Herbert Baer was kind of creating their own modernist style. So about 1960s, this kind of opposition started to rise and take hold, and that brought in this idea of New Wave typography. It began in Switzerland, like many type styles did, and then spread all over the world. The next person we're going to talk about is Wolfgang Weinhardt. So Wolfgang was among the first to really question the absolute order and cleanliness of the International Typographic Style, or ITS. He was one of the first to say, why are we doing this? Why are we making it so clean? Why does everything look the same? I don't understand, and we need to try something different. So he came to this conclusion that you'll need to know for your quiz. He concluded that the International Typographic Style had become so refined and so prevalent that it had reached the end of its growth possibility. There was nowhere else for it to go. Much like that idea of hand lettering and putting swashes on things, and something that's really popular now, that it's almost to the point to where it's been fully explored, there's no new things to do with it, so that it's outgrown any new possibility, so we have to bring something new in. Which is what's happened with 90s grunge design, what happened with kind of mid-2000s with minimalism, what's going to happen with the long shadow, the low poly, the hand lettering. It will all be so overdone that it needs to kind of be counteracted by something new. He started to reject this idea of laying out type on a right angle. He didn't want it to look like the International Typographic Style where it had the kind of jagged right edge. He wanted it to be dynamic and move and really make it so that you could feel the pieces. So because of that, he wanted to have a certain style, and he started working with lead type and letterpress systems. He worked a lot on personal projects. Now, working on personal projects gave him a new spirit and life to really explore what you could do with typography. It was no longer about working for a client, it was about exploring and working for the world of design as a whole. He would experiment a lot with letter spacing, orientation, and even the weights of the letters that he was using, as you can see here. He would make type stand out by putting it on a black chunky rectangle. So you put a huge rectangle with white type on top to really highlight that type, and almost paid homage back to the vestigial and Dada styles, but was processing it through what was happening with the International Typographic Style. At one point, he had an interview and someone asked him, what kind of typography do you use? What kind of type do you make? And his response was this: I make sunshine type. I make bunny type. I make ant type. I make type in 5 minutes. I make typewriter type. And sometimes I make type for the people. So he was focused on creating whatever the situation called for. He would adapt and create something new, not something that had been done before, to have a creative solution to whatever creative problem was coming up. By the 1970s, he started to set his designs into the world of offset printing and film. He started to move away from purely typographic design and started to embrace collage. This is some of his work as we looked at collage as kind of piecing things together, taking bits and pieces from other places and creating new works of art. And he started to embrace this idea of collage for his visual communication. You can see some more of his work here, of that collage that, again, it's very abstract, but it's paying homage back to the International Typographic style. It's clean, it has a jagged right edge on the type, it's somewhat on a grid, but yet that's being blown out of proportion by the collage elements, by the torn pieces, by the kind of insanity that's happening all around it. This is another piece that he created, and I'll give you a second to try to think how this makes you feel, where you think this is, what you think this is a poster for. It is promoting an event. So first thing about how it makes you feel. It's very unnerving, very exciting, very movement focused, a lot of jagged edges. And then you see within those jagged edges is a specific jagged edge right there in the center. And you can see that that ends up being the outline of the Matterhorn. So this is actually a promotion for an exhibition that he was having in Switzerland to talk about kind of the Swiss style and show off some of his best work. So we'll skip that. So Wolfgang Weinhardt really refused to work in a certain style. He really wanted to extend and expand the parameters of all typographic communication. So here you can see he's using that sans serif type, kind of a Helvetica, Altgrohask, but he's using this international typographic style, but expanding it, not working in a specific style. And his work was so widely imitated that it gave rise to kind of the prevailing typographic approach in the 1970s and 80s. The way that he did type, the way that he worked, was the way that everyone wanted to work. His most notable contributions to design were these kind of experimental pieces that he would work, where he would space out sans serif type, we looked at it earlier, and would use ruled lines, special pieces of punctuation, diagonals, change the type to italicized, change the orientation of the type, add type on bars, to really create stops, to really create moments of interest within simple type. The next person we're going to talk about is Mr. Dan Friedman. So Dan Friedman rethought really the nature of type and how it could operate within space. So Dan Friedman's notable for working in different space orientations. He was a teacher and taught at Yale University in their design program. He would do something interesting. As he was teaching design, he would teach design to his students and how to use design, especially in a postmodern way, through having them do weather reports. Now, let's look at some of his work real quick. Here you can see his real concentration at putting type within some kind of context and how it would operate in space. You can see it often lay out context at different angles, at different styles. It would be turned. It would kind of be within a 3D space and element. Here, he would give his students the weather report for the day. And the goal was for the students to use only typography and convey what the weather was going to be. So on the top left, you can see that one of those students took a purely international typographic style. You have the hard left edge, the jagged right edge set in Helvetica. But then as you look down below, you start to see some of the postmodern interpretations. The middle one on the bottom, you read it, and instead of just it being hot, and you see that it's hot, and you read that it's hot. In postmodernism, you look at that, and you try to feel what that word is saying to you. When you look at it and try to read it in that mindset, you read it hot. So you know that it is hot, that it has a kind of weight to it. That O is the sun giving off heat rays, and is supposed to be interpreted through the look and the weight of those letters in that piece. The next designer we're going to talk about is William Kuntz. So William Kuntz was responsible for introducing this kind of new typographic style into the United States. He created 12 new typographical interpretations. Through this, he was using kind of contrasting type weights, geometric stair-stepping, which stair-stepping is what you see on the top right here. Stair-stepping is where you start with a smaller typeface, and the type gets larger and larger and larger, kind of creating stair steps and kind of giving you that emotion so that you can understand and feel the type instead of just read it. He would also work a lot with lines and bars and kind of visual visual punctuation. These are some of the best examples of postmodern design. As you read these, they make you stop. They make you think. They make you feel things. On the top left, New Man is cinematic, sequential, pictorial. It makes you excited as you read it because the type is getting bigger. It's getting weightier. That line underneath is getting stronger. And these pieces really make you think about what you're reading instead of just reading it to get the information as clear as possible. So moving on, we'll talk about the San Francisco School. There was a new movement happening in San Francisco in postmodern design, and it started to gain prevalence in the end of the 1970s, so beginning 1980s, and designers started to become obsessed with textures, patterns, different surfaces, colors, and this idea of playful geometry. Now, if you think about the 80s, you'll 100% understand this statement. The 80s were full of different textures, different weird patterns, bright colors, different kind of playful geometry. And this all started kind of in the San Francisco School. The design community really kind of became a strong community, and really the strongest community in the area of San Francisco. So that community started to influence styles elsewhere. And by the early 1980s, San Francisco postmodern design was kind of the hub for postmodern design. This kind of movement made San Francisco the place to be if you were creative working in design. This is some of the work that you'll see coming out of the school in San Francisco. And through that thought, again, playing with geometric interpretation, playing with bright planes of color, playing with different textures, creating things that were almost in that Dada style of poking fun, but yet they still had a very clear communicative message that made you feel something. Here you can see a great example, working with those bright colors, very, very geometric on this piece, but yet you see a boring old building with a bright new building of San Francisco, geometric, and all these colors kind of sticking its tongue out, kind of being playful and silly, saying, "You're dumb, you stupid building that is so plain." And so San Francisco really started to work in this style and creating this new look that was new and bold and interesting and that people wanted to be a part of. So now we're going to talk about retro design. And people misuse this term a lot. They talk about retro and they're like, "Oh, that's so retro." And they're talking about like 1950s poodle skirt dresses, and they're talking about, oh, retro, like it's vintage and shabby chic. So retro specifically refers to a time period. So first, during the 1980s, designers started to finally understand and appreciate design history. This kind of caused a movement that first emerged in New York and then rapidly started to spread throughout the world. Now, the movement was called retro, like we said, and it's based on this. It's based on modernist European design from the first half of the century. So, European modernist design. The focus was a blatant disregard for the rules of typography. They wanted to go back and look at the type that was being used during the 1920s that had kind of been forgotten and wanted to bring it back. Retro design specifically works with a lot of precise spacing, a lot of scale relationship, and a lot of color combination. So we're talking now about kind of moving into that Art Deco, Russian constructivist, and bringing that into a modern style. So this, so someone that was working in that kind of style was Paula Scher, and she's still alive today. She's still an amazing designer, works at Pentagram, does absolutely incredible designs. And she is known for having a great sense of humor. So she started working for CBS Records in 1970s. And during this time, a lot of music graphics were very, very complex. There were huge budgets happening for a lot of photography, production photography, designers to create things, and even illustration. But by 1979, budgets started to shrink and get smaller and smaller. And what that did is it forced people like Paula Scher to come up with new ways to imagine and create fascination with obscure and little used typefaces that people hadn't seen before. So she worked mainly in these two styles of Art Deco and Russian Constructivism. Here we can see some of her work. She is a master of working with type. This is some of her work working again in that kind of Russian Constructivist style, but bringing it into a new place, making it interesting, making it bold, making it just a little bit different. And as she continues working with some of the, this is almost like a Words in Freedom kind of style of Filippo Marinetti, staying within that futurism to where it's different, it's new, but again, a master of typography. So the last person we're going to talk about worked specifically in the retro style, and that is Louis Fili. Louis Fili was an influential book jacket designer who would work in this new retro style. And he would use this style to really create book covers that made you feel something, that took you back to a specific time and place. He would use specific typography that was from the 1920s, 1930s to create these book covers that would transport you backward in time. She would take each book as its own entity and really try to make something that was the typeface fit, the color fit, the imagery fit, and really created this overall overview of the book. This is an example of some of her work. As you can see here, the imagery is perfect. The type is perfect. It takes you back to almost an Art Deco era. It's taking you back to the 1920s or 1930s, but this was created in 1985. So again, retro style is referring back to that period of just after the 1920s when they were trying to bring back these typefaces that had kind of been lost after the World War. So hopefully you enjoyed chapter 22. That's all we have today. If you have any time, go out and check out Paula Scher. See more of her work. It's absolutely incredible, and some of the stuff she's doing today is insane. So go check that out, and thanks for watching. Bye.